Viewers, as we head into second month of the Russia-Ukraine war, to discuss where is the end game, when is it likely to see a finish. Joining us from Moscow, Deputy Speaker of the Russian Senate and former diplomat, Ambassador Konstantin Kosachev. Welcome, sir.
Hello, sir.
This is Abhishek Kapoor from Noida studios of Republic Network. My first question to you, Ambassador Kosachev, is where is the war headed? It's nearing 2 months. When are we going to see an end game? Essentially, the Russians started it. The Russians have to tell us when is it going to end.
Well, obviously, the specially designed military operation of Russia in Ukraine will stop when we have reached the goals of this military operation. And the major goal of this operation is definitely not about territories. It is definitely not about changing the regime in Ukraine. It's about securing, granting our own national security, because we consider the current state of affairs in Ukraine, the way it developed the previous years, as a threat, military threat towards Russia. And we want to get rid of this military threat, which has been created artificially by the ruling authorities in Ukraine, supported by NATO countries. And this is probably the major problem, because we now have to deal not just with Ukrainian authorities, we have to deal with NATO standing behind Ukraine.
Ambassador, if the objective was to counter a military threat, and obviously that military threat was not from Ukraine but from NATO, I think you are not achieving your objective. In fact, you are complicating your security, because now Sweden and Finland also are in a mood to join NATO. This could be happening as soon as next month. In that sense, the Russian security environment gets even more compromised.
Well, there is one huge difference between Ukraine on one hand and any other country in Europe on the other hand. In 2014, a coup d'etat took place in Ukraine. Some people presented events in Ukraine in 2014 as a public riot, the democratic society getting rid of corrupted government. This is not the whole story. In 2014, a certain political power with a certain political program took power in Ukraine by force. This political program of this political party was to make Ukraine a unilateral state, a state with just one language, one ideology, one foreign policy, one history, and so on and so forth. And
Ambassador, you are skirting the question. My question was about NATO threat, and if the military operation was meant to contain the NATO is actually expanding now, even more.
This is the problem, because the people who live in southeastern Ukraine rejected this coup d'etat. They have not accepted it, neither in Crimea, nor in Donetsk, nor in Lugansk. And people in Kiev want to take back these territories by military force. And by that, they create a military threat towards Russia, which is not happening in our relations with either Finland or Sweden.
No, Ambassador, my question was, if the objective, if the entire objective of this military operation was to contain NATO, it's defeated, because NATO is expanding even more. It's going to Finland and Sweden now.
Once again, what we don't want to see is that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, because in that case, the next step would be Ukraine trying to take back Crimea from Russia, to restore control over territories in southeastern Ukraine by military force. And in that case, that military force will be supported and sponsored by other NATO countries. And that would place us in a situation where Russia would have to confront the whole NATO. And that is just one step away from a third world war. And this is what we want to escape. This is what we want to get rid of by this special military operation. We don't want to have a third world war between Russia
Did you
and
say
NATO.
world war? Did you say world war?
Ukraine.
There is a likelihood of world war? Did you say
yes,
world war?
I believe that NATO will not stop in Ukraine. In case Ukraine becomes a NATO member, NATO will proceed, and sooner or later we will have a very dangerous situation which can be leading into a huge military conflict between Russia and NATO, compared by the range, by the perspectives with a real world war. Yes.
All right. Deputy Speaker of Russian Senate, they're saying that there is a likelihood of world war if NATO continues to expand. But then you have still skirted my question that NATO actually continues to expand despite the military operation. But moving on, you know, the United States, the European nations, they are supplying Ukraine with huge amounts of weaponry, ammunition, even money, to the tune of about $3 billion. In fact, $800 million of them just last week by the United States. We cannot see an end to the war if Ukraine continues to replenish its war machine.
No.
Do you have any plan?
You know, my own
do the Russians really have a plan?
My own explanation of that is that NATO is not interested in seeing the end of this military conflict. They are interested in keeping it, so to say, alive as long as possible, because during this period of time, we may see how the West acts towards Russia. They have gone away beyond any borders of international law. They've crossed any possible red lines. They want to contain Russia. They want to destroy the Russian economy. They want to get rid of Russia as a competitor. And this is how they arrest the reserves of Russian valuta money amounts, and they do so many other things which are illegal. But they want to be able to do that in order to contain and to destroy Russia. And they need this military conflict the way it develops now as long as possible. It's not about Ukraine any longer. Ukraine is a hostage of this geopolitical conflict. And the conflict, yes, it is between Russia and NATO. It is not yet developing in military terms, but putting it frankly, it is a conflict between Russia and NATO, and the conflict is about whether the world will be a unipolar one, the way NATO-centric one, the way NATO countries want to see it, the way the United States of America wants to see it, or the world will be a multipolar one with good place for countries like India, like Russia, like any other sovereign countries being equal and having all possibilities to protect and to move forward their own national interests as sovereign countries. The model which is being forced by NATO on the rest of the world does not leave any space either for Russia or for any other sovereign country. This is what we are convinced about. And in that sense, we act now in the interests of the global community, not just Russia.
Right. So my next question is then, if you are saying that the war is actually between NATO and Russia, or West and Russia, Ukraine is just a hostage to global geopolitics. If the objective of NATO or the West is to degrade Russian capacity to fight a war, or generally compromise Russia's development, I think you are walking into the trap. If the war prolongs, the Russian economy would tank even further. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, number one, we on the Russian side are not interested in prolonging this conflict, definitely. And this is why we use any possibilities to keep the damages within the civil population of Ukraine as low, at as very low level, as low as possible. And this is why we insist on having negotiations with Ukraine. And these negotiations do not proceed well enough, not because Russia does not want to have the progress in these negotiations, but because Ukraine behaves in a very strange manner. First, they come to a certain negotiation table and they accept proposals made by Russia, and they make their own proposals which are more or less acceptable for Russia, but then they go somewhere else and they get instructions from somewhere. We may just guess where these instructions come from, but I believe it's both Washington and Brussels, and then they get back. They do not confirm the previous proposals they have accepted during the negotiations. And this is what makes us so much disappointed. The purpose of Russia is to reach a situation when Ukraine is a neutral state, when Ukraine is demilitarized and does not produce any military threat any longer, and denazified. No Nazi parties or groups should be allowed according to the Ukrainian law. These are our purposes, and definitely we want to protect the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, the positions of the Russian language, and definitely to delete any further speculations about the status of Crimea and the status of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. It is not for discussions, and that would be the end of the story. That would be the end of the conflict if the Ukrainian side accepts these quite clear and understandable conditions.
Ambassador Kosachev, you have yourself been sanctioned sometime in 2018. The sanctions are much more severe this time than in ever point in time of history so far as the West standoff with Russia is concerned. You are still not admitting to the economic costs that Russia is going to bear, effectively lending you, if I could use that word, a vassal state of China.
The sanctions are from the western part of the world. Russia is definitely not isolated. The Russian economy is definitely not in a dangerous zone. We are strong enough to overcome these sanctions coming from the West. And one of the reasons is that we still have normal trade and economy relations with much more countries, which very strong economies. The India is just one example, but there are many more examples of that. And we are absolutely sure that sanctions will definitely not destroy the Russian economy and for sure not influence the Russian foreign policy or the Russian domestic policy. Be sure we are strong and we are resolute on protecting our national interests against countries who want to hit Russia.
Right. My second last question, sir, before I come to the last one on peace talks. How real is the threat of use of tactical nukes? Is Russia, or has Russia at any point in time during this conflict contemplated the use of nuclear weapons? The fear in the global community is that if Russia gets into a situation where it's not finding an end to the war, it might try to force an end using a tactical nuke.
This is just speculations. No, my answer is definitely no. It does not belong to our plans. It is absolutely senseless as long as any kind of weapons of mass destruction are used by countries who possess these weapons and who support Ukraine, as long as these kind of weapons of mass destructions are not used against Russia, Russia will definitely not use any kind of weapons of mass destruction in this conflict. The clear answer on your question is no. This perspective is zero.
Right. Everyone in the world prays that that happens. My last question, Ambassador Kosachev. Where are the peace talks headed? You know, the first two rounds happened quickly between Minsk and Istanbul. But since then, there has been a hiatus. Why are we not hearing about the peace talks?
Well, the peace talks continue almost every day. They are being held in a video format, video conferences. The progress in these talks is not good enough, as I mentioned before. And the major reason is that the Ukrainian delegation and the position of the Ukrainian side during these talks is not consecutive. They do not hold their promises. They change their positions all the time. They want to, I do not know, they want to win time, or probably they are being kept also as hostages by their instructors coming from Washington, coming from Brussels, who do not allow them to make any compromises during these talks. Ukraine is not a sovereign country any longer. Ukraine is unfortunately under external rule as for now. It is not able to take any independent decisions, and this is what creates huge problems during the negotiations. We have to talk with Ukrainians formally, but we understand all the time, but there are people, there are countries, there are political forces behind Ukrainians who rule Ukrainians, who steer their behavior, and who do not let them make progress during the negotiations. And this is the major problem right now.
Right. You know, that's not a very positive note to end the interview with. But then, like rest of the world, we hope that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the West comes to an end soon in the interest of everyone. Thank you so much, Ambassador Konstantin Kosachev, for joining us from Moscow. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir.